So good evening, everybody. And I also would like to welcome you to the 8th annual Saul Cohen Shoki Jewish Family Service lecture featuring Barry Shrage this evening. I'm Matt Greenberg, CEO of Jewish Family Service. It's hard to believe that it's already been 8 years, and more than 8 years actually, since we sat down with the Cohens to discuss the creation of this wonderful evening. During the past 8 years, it was often Saul who stood here and welcomed you. In a few moments, you're going to hear a little bit more about Saul, for whom this lecture is named, and who left an indelible impact on me personally and on our community. Because of him and Mimi, we have had the privilege of being able to invite you for the last 8 years to this lecture as a way of saying thank you for supporting us and for recognizing the work that we do.
I'm Saul's daughter, and it's very fitting for me to have the honor to introduce Barry Shrage tonight. When I moved to Boston in 1989, Dad said to me, "You need to meet Barry Shrage. We go way back." Of course, my dad said that about a lot of people, so I wasn't really sure if that was true or not, but I've learned, and it's true. So let me explain. What you'll hear a lot about Barry is his community involvement in Boston, but before what I know him for is his 31 years as the inspirational leader of our Boston Federation, which is known as the CJP. Barry was a JCC executive, just like my dad. My dad started in JCC in 1964 in July at the Brighton Y, and in 1970, just a few years later, Barry started in at the Midwestchester Y. They both have their degrees in social work. Barry's was from Boston University, where my dad got his undergrad degree. And I've since learned that they went to lots of conferences together, and my dad was a mentor to Barry in many ways. So fast forward many years, Barry and the team he led in Boston's CJP creative integrated programs to make our community incredibly strong, and his legacy will be there forever. His work extended to day school and Jewish camps and synagogues and community outreach and Jewish identity, young adult engagement, the elderly, fundraising, our own Jewish family and children's services, and lots more. Last summer, when Barry stepped down from his position at the CJP, he started to give back in a different way, and he is now currently a professor at Brandeis University as a faculty member in the Hornstein program. So I could probably go on for a lot longer, but you'll be much more inspired when you hear him speak. So with all that, I'm going to introduce Barry Shrage.
It's a huge honor to be compared to Saul Cohen in any way, shape, or form. He was an extraordinary leader and a mentor. And it made me think back to the year that I entered Jewish community work, because it actually was 1969. I was a student at the Brookline Brighton Newton Jewish Community Center, also community centers, and what the world was like then and how different it is now, and in many ways different, in many ways the same, the struggles we had, the issues we dealt with, the things that we thought about. But through it all, the one thing, as I was talking to Mimi about this before, the one thing that was most clear is that we were both wildly optimistic and unrealistic about everything. For us, anything was possible. And we trafficked in ideas, in big ideas. But where does that come from? Where does this optimism come from? So I found a great quote that I will share with you. It's by a guy named Aaron Wildavsky. Anybody ever hear of him? No. Aaron Wildavsky was a great sociologist, passed away a number of years ago. He wrote about bureaucracies and how they work. He also wrote 2 incredible book-length Divrei Torah, one about Moshe and one about Yosef. And in this, he talks about what leadership is. So this is worth giving some thought to. Faith is the willingness to act in the absence of things seen. To have an idea that never had any reality to it, but see it alive in front of you. But faith in the future requires knowledge of the past. That's why I was asking you about Saul's background. Saul had a yeshiva education. You don't have to have a yeshiva education to have knowledge of the Jewish past, but you are going to have it if you do have that kind of background. And what does that mean? So Wildavsky goes on. knowledge of the past from which stems the fortitude to overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. The faith of leaders should thus be retrospective as well as prospective. They leap into I love this line, they leap into the void of the present, illuminated by past memory of promise for the future. Israel is taught to be historically minded, to speak of and interpret history. Without memory, there is no learning. Without learning, there can be no teaching. And without teaching, no one else will be able to remember. The social circle of remembrance is God's gift to Israel, without which its people would long since have perished. So, if you're any kind of Jewish leader, you've got to know that despite everything, we sort of found a way to survive, and not just survive and endure, but to change the history of the world. It's said that the Jewish people invented the idea of history. Wherever we went, we carried our culture with us, and we shared it with the people we engaged, and they shared theirs with us. Every time creating something brand new and amazing that we could then go on and share with the world. Jonathan Sacks, a great English rabbi, he talked about this in such an interesting way, and I want to stress this. In other words, our engagement with our people, our particular people, our love for the Jewish people, our concern for our own people, is there something politically incorrect about that these days? Is there something wrong with that? Is there something wrong with not being first and simply and always concerned about humanity? So Sacks said something incredibly important. He said that there is conversation among civilizations. And he didn't count Indian history or English history or Buddhist history as anything less important than Jewish history, but he said we have a message. We have something important to share in the conversation among civilizations. That's an important way of thinking about this. But in Saul's case, what did that mean? It meant he understood where we came from. And in understanding where we came from and what we survived and what we endured, and in spite of everything, what we gave to the world, he was able to use that optimism to create great things, to change communities, to change the future, and to believe that we will somehow or other not just survive again, but thrive, make a difference, create wonder drugs, change the way people think about civilization. It's said that actually it was in the 17th century England, a movement developed to translate, I can explain why, but it's too complicated, to translate for Christian theologians to translate the entire Talmud into the vernacular, to help them deal with theological questions that they had, and to literally change the way they thought about democracy and the king and the leadership and all the rest of that. We make a difference. That's what we need to tell our children, that we can make an enormous difference. And this is the kind of leadership we need in the next generation, or else we're going to have much more difficulty making it. And these are the lessons. I would write a book that's called The Lessons of Saul Cohen, Leadership Lessons of Saul Cohen, the things that we all need to remember if we're going to make a difference in the world. And I was fortunate to have him as a mentor and to be able to learn from him the things that I needed to know to go on and try to make the changes that we ultimately were able to make. So let's think back with us to those distant days of yesteryear. I think that's the way the Lone Ranger episodes come with us now, to those distant days of yesteryear. So this was, think about 1970 and who we were, who our generation was, and why we were optimistic. The '67 war changed our lives. It meant everything to us. Now, this is difficult for you to kind of remember. It was not a good thing. You were not jumping up and down proud about being different in American society before the late 60s. To be different was not to be good. You wanted to smell and look and feel. If you could, you would change your name. Many people did, right? They changed their names. They changed their hair. They straightened it. They changed their noses. They changed what they needed to change to be more Americans, and it wasn't just Jews who did that. African Americans lightened their skin. Italians changed their names. There was a major change that happened in the late 60s. And one of them was a kind of a fascination with being different. My favorite movie that spells this out is My Big Fat Greek Wedding. So what's the change in My Big Fat Greek Wedding? So who's the hero in My Big Fat Greek Wedding? This immigrant family, they're funny. He uses Windex to, take care of everything, and he's kind of a funny guy, and deeply proud of being Greek. And he's the hero of this movie. And who's the guy who you make fun of in this movie? The WASP, future son-in-law, and his family. Why? Because when they came to visit, they didn't bring something interesting and spicy, and they brought a bunt cake. And they made endless fun of this bunt cake. But what did that mean? It meant that all of a sudden you could be different in this country. You could be proud of who you were in this country. And that sense of optimism that we could actually survive, and not just survive, but thrive, make a difference, give our children a Jewish education, build new Jewish summer camps, create a revolution in Jewish identity and Jewish education. This is what it meant. Now, in a funny way, it really was Israel that gave us this power. The truth is that we were not going anyplace in the 1950s. Yes, we were building great synagogues and big buildings and all the rest of that, but they were pretty empty, honestly. For most people, they didn't represent anything especially spiritual. But all the non-Jews went to their churches, and we went to our synagogues, and it was part of being an American like everybody else. But at the end of the day, we needed something else to transform us and to make us proud and caring about being what we were and being willing to transmit that to our children. This sense of pride that came out of the Six-Day War, so, it's my son, Ari, is named after my grandfather, who I loved like crazy. We lived in the same room. I think of that room as a bridge between the 19th century, when my grandfather was born in 1880, and the name that my son carries as a bridge to the future, grandchildren that will live into new centuries. But that room was important to me, and it meant something, and that's why his name was Arla, so I named my son Ari. But there's another reason why I named my son Ari. Anybody want to know what that reason is? Anybody remember? Ari ben Canaan, exactly. Anybody know who that is? You all know who that is, right? The movie Exodus, Paul Newman, you remember? Ari actually bears a resemblance to Paul Newman, I think. He's never going to come to another one of these things again. But that was the impact of that book and that movie. The truth is that even though I went to yeshiva, I had no idea about what the history of Israel was. But when I read the book, all of a sudden I knew things about the Holocaust that I never knew before, about the birth of the state of Israel. And it changed the way I thought about being Jewish in very profound ways. And it made me committed to being sure that we would transmit this through Jewish education. And that's why I had this commitment lifelong to Jewish education and Jewish identity. But there was something that I didn't realize about this. See, we all had something different. We were born with and grew up with this incredible connection to the Jewish people, right? I mean, it was like they didn't have to teach us to love the Jewish people. It wasn't part of our Jewish education. You could go right to learning Torah or learning Jewish history, or you didn't have to start by saying, by the way, the reason you should care about this stuff is that we're connected to each other, that we love each other, that we want to survive as a people, that we want to help our brothers and sisters in places like this in every possible way that we can. And the reason for that is that we're connected. Now, something happened. The sense of ethnic connection began to deteriorate. It had to. First of all, you couldn't go any higher than the way you felt after the Six-Day War. It had to go down. It couldn't stay up. That sense of tremendous connection had to go someplace. So now we find ourselves trying to figure out what to do with the next generation that doesn't have this sense of ethnic connection. The intellectual understanding of Judaism is beautiful. I love Jewish learning. And I'm proud of my son and my daughter-in-law and my other children for the education that they have and the education they're giving their children. But the truth is that that intellectual connection can't exist alone. It really requires a sense of identification with the Jewish people. Now, here's where the problem comes in. The other thing that I want to talk about. You see, it turns out in this generation, the only thing that works to transform a person from being uninterested in a connection to the Jewish people, to being interested, happens to be a trip to Israel. It happens to be the thing that works. Other things work too. I love Jewish camping. I think it's great. But right now, we are actually bringing back 35,000 to 40,000 young Jews a year from Israel through birthright. That's kind of like a miracle. Whoever thought that that could happen? And every one of them, we do more studies at Brandeis than anywhere. We know that their lives are changed. They say, my life has been changed. Their connection to the Jewish people is transformed. So Israel becomes super important as a gateway to more Jewish education, more identification, and more commitment and connection. Now you come to the next thing. What happens if everywhere you go on campus, seemingly, someone is telling you that Israel is the most evil place on earth? That really, it's not just that we expect you, if you want to be part of the great progressive movement in this country, which I do, most people do, we are committed to social justice and to changing the world. It's part of what the Torah teaches us. It's super important. But what do you do if you're told that just caring about Israel makes you a war criminal, which is the message that you get in intersectional circles on many campuses? What do you do about that? So people are very worried about that there's going to be a distancing between the American Jewish community, between our children and their children, and that will not just have an impact on the way we politically help or support Israel, but will actually steal the Jewish identity of our children and grandchildren, that it will have a devastating impact on the way they feel about being part of this amazing, wonderful Jewish people. That's the area that really concerns me. That's what I think about. And of course, it's on one hand, it's sort of insane. I mean, last month, two congresswomen who despise Israel, I don't think there's much argument about that, weren't allowed in. I personally thought that was a mistake. It wouldn't have hurt to let them go in. It would have helped us in all kinds of different ways. But Israel made the decision they did. But that wasn't a war crime, as many people tried to. It didn't mean the end of Israeli democracy. And yet it filled the newspapers for days, weeks. And I was reading the New York Times at the same time, and I saw something interesting. 750,000 Muslims, Rohingya Muslims, living under a Buddhist regime in Myanmar, were systematically tortured, murdered, driven out of their country in leaky boats, or just slaughtered. And guess what? No one cared. No one knew. It wasn't a subject for any kind of discussion at all. And at the same time, China decided to close off the Muslim minority in China, and with huge oppression, and no one cared. And at the same time, the Hindus in India decided to close off the Muslim territory in India with huge negative effects on that population. So look, Israel's not perfect, but it's in a very, very dangerous and bad neighborhood. And at least we need to be thinking about what is our connection to that people and understanding them. And I think in a way that's really crucial. That's the question that we have to give our children. That's the question that we have to ask. Do you really understand what our brothers and sisters are going through? Do you know who they are? I'm personally not an advocate of having long discussions with Arabs or Jews about what's going on the West Bank or the politics. Before we get into the politics, we ought to know who our friends and neighbors and brothers and sisters are. That's the one thing that Birthright does, is it introduces them to Israelis that they can get to know and care about as human beings. Then we can have a discussion. There was a wonderful book by Daniel Gordis called Divided We Stand. And in it, he makes a couple of excellent points. He goes, do we really know? I mean, he's angry. Danny Gordis is pretty angry. Why is he angry? Because all of his kids were in special units in the Army, and he was waiting up late at night to see whether they came back. And then he's reading in American papers that young American kids just, have no understanding of what he's going through whatsoever. And he brings the following interesting example. Look, when an Israeli, it's true that young adult Israelis, are now moving to the right politically, while young adult American Jews are moving to the left. That's perfectly clear. But why? Why does this happen? And Gordis says the following. He goes, look, when a 22-year-old Israeli was 5 years old, mommy gave him a Spider-Man backpack, like an American kid, or a Spider-Man lunchbox, and sent him off to school, but she gave him one more thing. She gave him a cell phone. Why'd she get a cell phone? Because she wanted him to call when he got to school so that she would know that he wasn't dead. That means that sense of growing up in a totally different, our kids have a different life. And Gorda says, since you will never understand what we go through, he almost says that the rift is irreparable. You cannot understand us. And therefore, this rift will grow bigger and bigger until it actually threatens the Jewish identity of the American Jewish community. Now, I think he's wrong. I think he's way over pessimistic about this. Because the truth is, you don't have to live the life of another person to have empathy for that person, to try to understand what that person goes through. I'm a big fan of engagement programs. In Boston, we send 700 children from Boston a year to Haifa, to the schools of the Haifa kids, and 700 Haifa kids come to Boston. Over 20 years, that's 14,000 kids on each side that got to know each other as human beings. We need these kinds of programs. We need to double down on birthright. We need to double down on birthright follow-up. Not so that everyone would think that Israel is perfect, just that we would be able to understand our brothers and sisters in human terms. You don't have to approve of Netanyahu. They don't have to approve or disapprove of who we vote for. But at least we ought to know each other and care about each other in order to be able to, and it works. Getting to know each other works. I just want to say one more thing, and then I'll end it and we can ask some questions. I was interviewing people who were coming in to be the new director of the Hornstein program at Brandeis, trains Jewish communal leaders. And they were going on about, well, we've got big problems. Synagogues are falling apart. Fewer and fewer Jews join synagogues. Young American Jews hate Israel. Birthright doesn't work because it's being broken by If Not Now and other groups that just, they see how positive Israel is for the next generation of Jews, and they don't want it to be. They don't want young American Jews to love Israel, so they disrupt these programs for whatever their own reasons are. Therefore, say these candidates who want to be the head of the school, we're in deep trouble. So here's the question I ask them. What if you're wrong? What if you're completely, entirely wrong? And you're about to educate a generation for problems that you completely misunderstand. One example, synagogues aren't dying. Synagogues aren't dying at all. In Boston, the synagogues are doing absolutely great. There was one synagogue that died. It wasn't a natural death. It was suicide. This synagogue just did everything that they could possibly humanly do wrong. But in the meantime, Beth Elohim is growing like crazy in Boston. Most of the Reform synagogues are doing great. And all the rest of the conservative synagogues, guess what? They're also doing great. You know why? Because it's not like everyone hates institutions in this generation. People yearn for contact. They yearn for love. They yearn to be part of something bigger than themselves. It's lonely out there. Synagogues have the capacity to make things better, much better. So they go, well, but young adults don't join synagogues. I go, excuse me? Young adults never join synagogues. They have better things to do on Saturday morning in their own minds. I mean, Orthodox kids do, and I love synagogue. I love being in synagogue. But it's not exactly where you ever found a lot of young adults. But when they get married and when they need to find true meaning and they want to raise their kids as Jews, there's a life cycle pattern, and those synagogues come out real well. They come out real well, and they have a great future. And to people who say we need to back all these new innovative programs, I say, when you find a program that can match what a synagogue can do in terms of creating connection and identity, and in terms of creating, what does it have? It has camps, it has Israel travel, it has schools, it has adult learning, it has preschools. When you can find an institution that can do all of those things, then we can talk about maybe replacing them. But the next generation doesn't automatically, look, I was part of the most crazed generation of all time. I was the 60s generation. We were entirely insane. It wasn't just that we were against institutions. Some of my more animated friends were blowing them up. And yet most of my friends are members of synagogues, and most of my friends are officers of their synagogues. Who would have known? Who would have thought of it? As a famous philosopher once said, predictions are difficult, especially about the future. You know who that was? It was Yogi Berra. And I think you've got to be careful with your predictions unless you want to make some really terrible mistakes. And let's look at this question of young adults. The New York Times, in its infinite wisdom, published 2 full-page, I think 4-page spreads on If Not Now, a radical Jewish group, disrupting birthright trips to Israel. It was gigantic. I mean, it paid more attention to that than, what our president was doing. It was like the biggest thing of all time. And in a way, it carried out, there is a guy named Peter Beinart who made, 20 years ago that it was going to ruin American Jewry. Our kids' love of Israel was going to disappear and American Jewry would be harmed by it. And that theory actually, in some ways, still inspires journalists to follow that idea and believe that it still is happening. But guess what? A grand total of maybe 20, if not now, kids disrupted maybe 3 birthright trips. The people on those trips wrote lengthy articles talking about how disturbed they were that their very nice trips were being dismantled by these other people who came in particularly to destroy the trip. And at the end of the day, we're still sending 35,000 kids a year to Israel. It did nothing, and yet the perception is that our children are running away, and they're not running away. Best example for me is just, if you're ever on a birthright bus, you see, you would think that kids who are anti-military and anti-colonialist and just hate particularity and just filled with that you would think that when they met an Israeli soldier on the bus that they would spit. But you know what? You got to look at what they are in awe of the Israeli soldiers, universally in awe of the Israeli soldiers, not just accepting. I'm talking about not different from the way I felt when I met my first Israeli soldier, like, oh my God, I wish I could be this person. I wish I could be as brave and as beautiful and as committed as that person is. So particularity is still alive. We still care about our people. We have to fan that flame. But let me stress, so we need to fan that flame without dousing the flame of commitment to social justice on their part. You can be deeply particularistic and in love with your people and deeply caring about the rest of the world. That's what I always wanted to do at CJP. I wanted us to be the most particularistic, the most committed to Israel, the most committed to Jewish learning. But when the president decided to throw immigrants out of the country, we raised $700,000 in 3 days from many people who were, some who were actually fans of the president, but the idea that a poor immigrant was going to just be kicked out without due process was too much. So we raised $700,000 in a couple of days. We gave it to Catholic Charities, who had a huge program of legal defense for undocumented immigrants. And everyone, right, left, and center, was proud of what our community was able to do because we care about social justice, because our particularity doesn't make us less committed to humanity, because our humanity actually, our commitment to humanity is not genetic. We give more charity. We give more to liberal causes. We do all of that. Why? It's not, if I said it was genetic, you'd say you're a racist, and you'd be right. It's not. It's because every year, during a certain month of the year, we sit down around a big table and we say, these are the tears of oppressed people. Never forget what it's like to be an oppressed person. This God is not just about social justice or about tikkun olam. This is a God and a tradition that despises the oppression of poor people. And we carry both of those things in our heart. And that's what the next generation needs to hear from us. So Beinart said, if you want to engage the next generation, you have to read the survey, know they hate Israel, and support them in their dislike of Israel. I go like, really? Really? You think that's what young people want? They want adults who read their surveys, see what they think, and then fulfill what they think is the right thing to do instead of saying, hey, look, if I seriously believe that that settlements are bad, I ought to be able to tell them. If I think that they're being too hard on Israel, I ought to be able to tell them, because that's what adults are supposed to do. We're supposed to stand for something. If we stand for something for our people, for our tradition, for the beauty of what it means to be Jewish, for our commitment to the state of Israel, without necessarily signing on to every one of their policies, if we do that, the next generation is going to come out fine. They're going to go to Israel. When you send 40,000 kids to Israel every year, you're sending about half a generation over time to Israel. And they're coming back, and they say the same thing every time you run the survey, and they say, it changed our lives. And we together can change people's lives. We have to be committed to Jewish identity and Jewish education. And we have to remember that God told us that in order to be true to who we are, we can love Jewish education and spend as much as we want on that and travel to Israel. But if God forbid we forget about lonely senior citizens, the kind of things that this Jewish family service does, if we forget them, we're completely forgetting who we are. If we forget about poor Jews or poor people, we're completely abandoning who we are. If we forget about the need to support programs that send kids to camp, which you also do, we're completely abandoning who we are. All of those things are essential. We can't forget about people who are hurting and hungry and oppressed and lonely, because that means that we're giving up our essential heritage. We can be strong Jews, deeply committed to the world. It's what we've learned from time immemorial. And this place, this Jewish family service that was so important to Saul and to his family and to all of you, represents so much of what we can be and what we can do. So thank you very much.
Lecture resonated very much with me, particularly you're trying to marry the beauty of Judaism and having the intellectual, the emotional, and the spiritual get together to that effect. So it affected me very positively. And I also agree with you that the left, political left in the United States is a thing which we have to tackle with. However, it seems to me that you left out of the equation the Orthodox right in Israel, which I think is a various danger, the enemy from within. They create a considerable dissension and problem, and they are against pluralism. They have my way or the highway. So don't you think that we have to tackle them? There are lots of Jews who may not be halakhically Jewish, but emotionally and intellectually and through their deeds, they prove that they are committed to the Jewish people, and they have the problem of joining the Jewish people, and we need people. We are a small people.
I have a suggestion. I think that I have a very broad definition of a committed Jew. I spoke about Julian Edelman before, but I don't want to alienate any more people in the audience who might not, approve of my sports predilections. But the thing about Israel is, in anything that we do, we've got to be listening to them as well as talking to them. There have been huge changes in Israel, and we need to think about how we engage those changes. So I agree on in one sense, which is to say, when I speak to Israeli audiences in Haifa, because we have this relationship with Haifa, which is very much part of this attempt to create real relationships. And, what I say to them, and they're very open to it, is, it's not that the Haredi are evil or bad. It's just you can't let them define what it means to be a Jew for you. You have to take control of that. And by the way, the laws and all that, I understand they're important, but any Israeli that wants to can join a Reform synagogue. Any Israeli who wants to, and by the way, any Israeli who wants to can go to Cyprus, many do, to get married because for many Israelis, not all, they disapprove of the Rabbanut and they'd rather not have anything to do with it. But it's up to them in a way to create a Judaism that they care about, that defines them. They need to, the resistance should not be that difficult. And we can't expect them to recreate our kind of Judaism. They're not going to want to be American Reform Jews. But the movements in Israel are really about creating a native kind of Israeli Judaism that's pluralistic and beautiful, and we need to help them. The things to fund and to help and to support are the many programs that are bringing this kind of perspective to Israelis. And of course, when you bring young Israelis to the United States, when we bring kids from Haifa, we also bring their teachers from their schools, and the teachers learn something incredible. I mean, if they believed, based on what they heard in Israel, that any religion that would have a woman rabbi is ridiculous. How can you have a Judaism that has women rabbis? But when you come to visit, you realize that actually it's quite beautiful, quite meaningful, changes the way you perceive everything about that, and it begins to give you the energy you need to take it back. Israelis need to take back the most important thing of what we are, which is our faith. They need to find ways to define it. At the end of the day, they could define it Orthodox or define it something else, but they need to own it. Our faith has never been something that was supposed to be imposed on people. It's supposed to be freely chosen. So,
how do you reconcile your very optimistic view of the Jewish community in America with the skyrocketing intermarriage rate and demographers' prediction that the Jewish community in America is slowly vanishing?
That's there was a Look magazine article called "The Vanishing American Jew," and then Alan Dershowitz wrote a book called "The Vanishing American Jew," and what he said in the book was, Look magazine predicted that American Jews would vanish, but guess what vanished? Yeah, Look magazine's gone. We're still here, and we evolve and we change and we do the best that we can. I mean, the truth is that we're actually doing better than anyone ever thought we would in terms of engaging interfaith families in the Jewish community by being open and welcoming, and I don't think we have much choice but to do that. And what I think is really interesting is that it's frequently the non-Jewish spouse that is the most interested in learning more about what it's like to be Jewish. The non-Jewish spouse grew up as a Christian where there's actually a religious faith. There are things that you have to believe. There are things that you have to know. So she goes to her Jewish spouse or his Jewish spouse and says, what is this religion all about? And the Jewish spouse goes, I have no idea. Go to the rabbi. So you meet everybody where you can, and you try to be helpful to people in every way that you can. That was what our federation did. We were the first federation to deeply engage with interfaith families, and it didn't raise the intermarriage rate, but it did bring a lot more people into the community than we ever had before. We made a decision to engage with gay and lesbian households. Our sense of engagement was actually something our board turned out to be very proud of. Every new talented person you bring in increases the odds that something amazing is going to happen and be created in the Jewish community. What do we do about BDS on campus? So first place, this goes back to this optimism, pessimism thing. All the surveys that we do at Brandeis on campuses across the country, there are not many supporters of this thing. We don't want to give Peter Beinart a victory, by saying you were right, Jews are turning against Israel like crazy. And, it's like, so there's a campus, right? And an Israeli speaker comes and he's shouted off the stage by 10 protesters, while the audience is filled with, 100 young people who want to hear this person. So there are ways to handle this. I think we need to work with the administrations of universities. A person who disrupts a lecture ought to just, in my view, just plain be expelled from the school. I mean, what a school is there for is to have dialogue and to listen to people who have different opinions. And if they literally kill free speech on campus, like a Nazi brown shirt, that would be, we need to work with the administration to try to be sure to the extent that we can this doesn't happen. But we also shouldn't exaggerate it. For every kid who's a protester, there were probably 600 kids on that campus who went to Israel on birthright, and they might not show up at a demonstration, but they care, and you don't want to make them more than they are. Like I said, by giving 7 pages of New York Times space to a group that represents 24 people, it's the enemy is the newspaper on this thing. It's not the protesters. So we need to give our kids, like I said about Saul, we need to have confidence in the future. We need to be optimistic about the future. Yeah.
I went on Birthright. I thought it was a wonderful program. I was just wondering how you feel like we can engage young adults after Birthright is over. Not just, obviously you mentioned the one-time speech, meeting, but how can we do it further and more?
Yeah. It's simple. People come to me and they'll say, because I'm a big supporter of Birthright, they go, why should I give money to Birthright? There's no follow-up. And I go, wait a minute. Birthright does what Birthright's supposed to do. They take, around the world, 60,000 or so kids to Israel and bring them home relatively in one piece, safe, happy, feeling good about other Jews in Israel and all the rest of that. It's a gift on a silver platter to the American Jewish community. So I would actually say that the American Jewish community is guilty of criminal negligence. Not them, we are. Why don't we do something with them? We managed to raise funds at the Boston Federation. We put a full-time person on 27 different campuses around the country, even though theoretically the rest of the country is not our business, but we felt it was important. Just with one job, pick up on the Birthright kids when they come back and engage them in something on campus. And there are programs that can do this. But if we don't, whose fault is it? If we don't do, why would we not? Every Jewish organization says, I care about the next generation. I want those young adults involved. Do they put any effort into it? Do they have programs for it? There's no, there are organizations that care about day school education. No one is really organized to care about young adults. It's not part of anyone's necessary agenda. That's why it's important that the Family Service actually has a program for Jewish young adults. It's not the norm. It's not what's out there all the time. So, if you want to get angry at your federation. Get angry at the people who aren't doing anything. It's who's supposed to be planning? Who's supposed to be thinking about these things? And if the leadership won't do it, then we have to do it, and we have to make sure that. So of course they should get of course they should be connected to Jewish educators. Yes.
My daughter came back from Birthright to New York City. She was asked to host Shabbats, and she would get friends together, not kids that went on Birthright, and Birthright would sponsor the meal for them to have Shabbat, and it became a regular thing. There's
an excellent Shabbat program. It's just not enough. That's really the problem. I mean, it's not nearly enough. We're investing, I think we figured it out, we're investing like $120 million a year in Birthright, and we're probably investing, under $5 million a year on young adult programs. So, yeah.
If you agree with someone who I won't name, that powerful media organizations like the New York Times deliver fake news, what can we do about that?
I don't agree that the New York Times delivers only fake news. I happen to disagree with a lot of the news that they generate. But look, there are good organizations like Camera and other organizations that try to correct a lot of the stuff that's in the newspapers. But we're in a time when there's really a media bias. There really is a media bias against Israel, and it really grows out of a kind of a bias for universalism over particularism, a kind of a buy-in of this narrative that says that Israel is an imperialist implant in the Middle East. Those are bad things, and if it's in the minds of reporters, it's problematic. The best programs on campus, in addition to Birthright and some of the other stuff, are the programs that are taking large numbers of non-Jewish students, leaders, to Israel to let them experience it. And by the way, they don't just go to Jewish sites. They don't just go to settlers they meet the leadership of the Palestinians in Ramallah. And because these are sophisticated, older students and many non-Jews, they have to see a full picture, but they always come back deeply committed to Israel. And there are programs that try to expose journalists also in some better way. I mean, the people who are over there are the only ones that are having a say in what's coming out in the papers. And there's lots of stories out there about how they're intimidated by the other side to saying the things that the other side wants them to say. But it's difficult. It is difficult. I mean, what's America going to see? They're not going to see Israelis, blown up by rockets. They're going to be shown, what's happening on the other side. And as unfair as it is, we just have to do our best in public and always, and especially with our politicians, to just remind them of what the truth is in every way that we possibly can. No easy answer.
Thank you. A marvelous program, both for the patrons' dinner and tonight. What do you think about the use of a proactive use of the legal system to protect Jews on campus from organizations like SJP or stuff like that?
I think wherever you can use the courts, I think it's great. There's a great program. Actually, a friend of mine in my synagogue who's a law professor at Harvard, and he just put together like next to nothing, like $120,000 a year. And what happened was when the Language Association or one of those associations, the Modern Language Association, condemned Israel and backed BDS and all the rest of that, he sued them. He tied them up in court for 2 years because he said it's not part of the mandate of the organization. They violated their own internal rules, and he just, not only that, there hasn't been a lot of other stuff going on like that because they're afraid of being tied up in the courts for the next 3 years in that, and at the end of the day, he won. And by the way, anybody who wants to contribute to his little fund, he doesn't even need much money. And it's a great program, and there's more of that stuff. I think using the courts is a good idea, and I think we can't insist that professors teach what they don't want to teach. We can't change what goes on in the classroom, but for the most part, the deep anti-Israel bias is coming out of Middle East studies departments, not out of the general faculty. We have a program at Brandeis that actually takes regular faculty from universities across the country to Israel studies programs, not biased, as neutral as it can possibly be, because it has to be for academia, but it makes a difference. Those are the kind of programs that are positive. Getting up and yelling and screaming and calling the other side all kinds of names and raising money just to yell and scream, it's not going to get us anywhere, really. But there's positive things that we can do, and you really hit the nail on the head with one of them.
Thank you, Barry.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more. And we're especially pleased to remind you that thanks to a generous matching gift from the Cayley family, every new or increased dollar you donate to JBS will be worth double to JBS. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please, indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, P.O. Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.